When my husband's older brother, a proud Navy lieutenant, looked across the crowded family dinner table and smirked, I knew what was coming. "You're in the Navy? Let me guess. I bet you've never been on a real mission," he said, loud enough for the whole room to quiet down. His wife snickered, and my father-in-law shook his head in pity. They thought I was just a desk-bound paper pusher who married into a real military family. But an older man sitting at the head of the table, a retired four-star admiral everyone in the room revered, slowly set down his glass and looked up at me. "What's your call sign, son?" he asked softly. The moment I spoke those two words, the room went dead silent. The admiral stood up at attention, and my brother-in-law's smug smile vanished instantly. Before I tell you how his face fell, drop a comment with a city or country you're watching from so I can see how far this story travels. My name is Maya Foster. At 28 years old, I've learned that the loudest people in the room are usually the ones with the least to say. That evening, the air inside the grand dining room in suburban Virginia was thick with the scent of roasted meats and decades of military tradition. My husband, David, sat beside me, gently resting a reassuring hand on my knee. His family was legendary in defense circles, generations of officers who wore their service like armor. And then there was me. To everyone sitting around that long mahogany table, I was just David's quiet wife, a mid-level office clerk working some obscure administrative job at the naval base. Because of strict non-disclosure protocols and the sheer sensitivity of my work, I never talked about my day. I let them believe I filed reports, organized schedules, and answered phones. That silence, however, came at a price. My brother-in-law, Mark, made sure to remind me of my place every chance he got. To him, service was about rank, chest ribbons, and holding court over dinner. As the caterers cleared the salad plates, Mark adjusted his dress uniform, leaned back in his chair, and looked across the table at me with a smirk that practically dripped with condescension. He didn't know it yet, but the quiet girl sitting across from him had spent the last 5 years walking through doors he couldn't even get security clearance to see. Mark cleared his throat, commanding the attention of the entire room. He began recounting his recent deployment, a routine, 4-month rotation in the Mediterranean. The way he spoke, you would have thought he single-handedly secured the entire hemisphere. He gestured dramatically with his glass, soaking in the admiring nods from his mother and the polite smiles from the family friends seated around us. Then his gaze drifted back to me. "Of course," Mark said, his voice dropping into that familiar, patronizing tone he loved to use. "Some people's idea of service is a bit more relaxed. Right, Maya?" A light ripple of laughter floated across the table. My mother-in-law offered a soft, pitying smile, while David's father simply shook his head. "Mark, leave it alone," David said quietly, his grip tightening on my hand under the table. "I'm just asking," Mark chuckled, waving off David's warning. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the crisp white tablecloth, looking at me like an adult addressing a toddler. "I mean, it must be nice, Maya. You get to go home at 5 o'clock every day, sip coffee in an air-conditioned office, and push paper around. Must be hard work." He paused, ensuring the room was completely silent before landing the final blow. "You're in the Navy? Let me guess. I bet you've never been on a real mission." Mark's wife snickered into her napkin. The disrespect was sharp, deliberate, and designed to put me firmly in my place as the civilian outsider who didn't belong in their heroic bloodline. I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my voice or offer an angry defense. I just took a slow sip of water and looked past Mark, noticing that sitting at the head of the table, Admiral Sterling had suddenly stopped chewing. The laughter around the table faded into a comfortable chuckle as Mark smirked, thoroughly satisfied with himself. He sat back, taking a triumphant sip of his wine, waiting for me to stammer out an excuse or look down at my plate in shame. Instead, the silence in the room began to stretch, turning uncomfortably heavy. At the head of the table sat Admiral Sterling, a legend in naval operations, a man whose chest was heavy with medals, and someone even David's proud father spoke to with quiet reverence. The Admiral hadn't laughed. He sat perfectly still, his razor-sharp eyes locked onto me from across the mahogany table. He slowly set his crystal glass down, the soft clink echoing through the quiet room. Ignoring Mark entirely, the Admiral leaned forward. His voice wasn't loud, but it possessed the kind of quiet authority that instantly commanded absolute silence. "What's your call sign, son?" he asked softly. Mark let out a half-hearted scoff. "Sir, with all due respect, she's just an administrative officer." "I didn't ask you, Lieutenant." Admiral Sterling cut in, his voice dropping an octave, cold and sharp as iron. Mark's mouth snapped shut. The room held its breath. I met the Admiral's gaze calmly, standing tall in my chair. "Ghost One, Admiral," I said, my voice steady and clear. "Naval Special Warfare Intelligence, Tactical Support Unit." Admiral Sterling's eyes widened. The color slowly drained from his face as the realization hit him like a physical strike. The silence in the room became absolute. The air grew, so still you could hear the soft humming of the air conditioner overhead. Mark blinked, looking confused between the Admiral and me. "Ghost One? Sir, that's just a rumor from the Eastern Mediterranean deployment 2 years ago. That wasn't even a real." Admiral Sterling didn't wait for him to finish. Slowly, deliberately, the 4-star Admiral pushed his chair back and stood up. Across the entire table, every military officer instinctively straightened their posture, but the Admiral wasn't looking at them. He was looking directly at me. "Ghost One," Admiral Sterling murmured, his voice laced with profound respect. He turned his eyes toward the rest of the family. 3 years ago, in the mountains outside Al-Hasaka, an entire joint reconnaissance team was pinned down behind enemy lines. Satellite comms were jammed, weather was down to 0 visibility, and 2 regional commands were actively preparing to write those men off. Mark's jaw slowly dropped. He knew this story. Every young officer in naval intelligence was forced to study it as a textbook example of elite, high-risk tactical execution. A single operative on a tactical feed ignored 3 separate abort orders. The Admiral continued, his commanding voice filling every corner of the room. She manually rerouted scrambled signal arrays, mapped an unmarked blind insertion corridor through heavy anti-air fire, and guided a night strike team in to pull 11 men out alive without a single casualty. Admiral Sterling looked back down at Mark, whose face had gone completely ghost white. The operative who coordinated that impossible extraction under direct fire, the one the Joint Chiefs personally decorated in a closed-door ceremony, was sitting right here across from you, Lieutenant. As the Admiral's words hung in the air, my mind drifted back to that night 3 years ago. It wasn't like the glorified combat stories Mark loved to tell over steak dinners. There were no cameras, no victory laps, and certainly no bravado. It was just a windowless command bunker buried deep underground, smelling of stale coffee, ozone, and static electricity. The room hummed with the high-pitched whine of overworked server racks as rain lashed against the exterior walls miles away. On my primary monitor, 11 digital green blips were pulsing erratically on a thermal grid. Surrounding them were dozens of fast-moving red signatures closing in fast. Through my headset, I could hear the crackle of heavy automatic fire, the deafening thud of mortar impacts, and the harsh, ragged breathing of men who fully believed they were going to die in the dark. When the regional command ordered us to abandon the feed and abort the rescue due to weather, the entire control room froze. People looked down at their keyboards, paralyzed by bureaucracy. But I didn't stop typing. I knew those 11 men weren't just tactical assets. They had wives, children, and families waiting for them back home. For 7 straight hours without taking a single breath of relief, I stared at those monitors. My fingers flew across the terminal, recalibrating dead satellite feeds, overriding automated air traffic safety locks, and threading a rescue helicopter through a mountain pass so narrow that a single gust of wind would have slammed them into the canyon wall. When the tactical radio finally crackled with the words, "Package secured," all 11 breathing, I didn't cheer. I didn't brag. I just closed my laptop, leaned back in my chair, and rubbed my bloodshot eyes in the quiet darkness of that subterranean vault. That was the reality of a real mission. It wasn't about wearing a pristine dress uniform to impress people at a dinner party, or boasting about routine patrols over a glass of wine. True service was carried in silence. It was about standing in the shadow between life and death, holding the weight of human lives in your hands and walking away without ever needing the world to applaud you for it. The memory faded, bringing me right back to the suffocating quiet of the Virginia dining room. Mark sat frozen, his fork hovering inches above his plate. The smug arrogance that had defined his face just moments ago was completely gone, replaced by a pale, hollow shock. He looked at me, then at the Admiral, then back to me, his brain desperately trying to reconcile the quiet office girl with the tactical legend he had spent his career hearing about. I had no idea, Mark stammered, his voice stripped of all its former confidence. Maya, I thought you were just... You thought she was weak because she didn't feel the need to broadcast her accomplishments to everyone with a pulse. Admiral Sterling interrupted, his voice dropping into a stern, razor-sharp rumble. That is the difference between a real operative and someone who just enjoys wearing the uniform, Lieutenant. Mark flinched, as if he'd been struck across the face. Sitting beside him, his wife stared down at her lap, her face burning bright red with embarrassment. My father-in-law, who had spent years casually dismissing my career, looked at me with an expression of profound, unspoken regret. The rest of the relatives sat in stunned awe, suddenly realizing that the quietest person at the dinner table was the most dangerous and respected person in the entire room. David squeezed my hand under the table, giving me a proud, beaming smile. Mark tried to open his mouth to offer another stuttering apology, but the Admiral simply raised a hand, cutting him off completely. Mark sank back into his chair, looking smaller and more humbled than he ever had in his life. I didn't smile and I didn't gloat. I simply picked up my water glass and took a slow, calm sip, letting the moment settle over the room. The rest of the evening passed in a completely different atmosphere. Mark remained subdued and quiet, barely speaking a word, while Admiral Sterling spent the remainder of dinner engaging me in deep, respectful conversations about modern intelligence networks. I was no longer the outsider sitting at the edge of the table. I was the anchor of the conversation. True strength never needs to scream for attention. It speaks in the lives you save, the duties you honor, and the quiet dignity you maintain when others try to tear you down. Mark learned a hard lesson that night about who he was sitting across from, but more importantly, I reminded myself that I never need anyone's permission to know my own worth. Have you ever been completely underestimated by someone who later had to eat their words? Drop your story in the comments below. I'd love to read it. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories like this. Thank you for watching.